Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Blurred Borders. How can the Smithsonian American Art Museum help you teach? Session 2. So, back by popular demand, we're going to overview some of last week's information and share a lot more today. I'm Jared Hartzler, the Executive Director of the Ohio Alliance for Arts Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's session. A little bit about housekeeping. Microphones were muted for everyone upon entry. Please keep them muted to reduce distractions for other participants unless we ask you to participate and unmute. Please respect all participants by not disturbing the meeting with annotations, sounds, or images. We, of course, reserve the right to remove participants if necessary. Today's session is being recorded. It will be available for playback on the Ohio Alliance for Arts Education YouTube channel. There will be a question and answer period following the presentation, so please use the chat functions to ask questions during the session. Stay focused. Don't overflow the chat with unnecessary banter or side conversations. At that Q&A session, Helen Buck-Pavlik and I will help facilitate all of that Q&A session. I just want to thank the partners that make all of these sessions possible. The Ohio Arts Council, of course, the Ohio Alliance for Arts Education, Ohio Dance, the Ohio Music Education Association, the Ohio Art Education Association, and the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. With that, I will turn the microphone to my colleague, Helen Buck-Pavlik from the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce to introduce today's speaker. Thank you, Helen. Welcome.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you if you're watching this recording for watching. So we can get a sense of who's in the room. Would you please drop into the chat your name, your school or place of work, the subject that you teach primarily, or work with primarily, or engage in, the grade level of students that you typically work with, and what your teaching superpower is. Lots of flexibility on that, just so we have an idea of who is in the room. So, and while you're doing that, I would just like to thank everyone that was here last week, or those of you that are joining for the first time for this part 2 session, for being with us today. And Peg with the Smithsonian American Art Museum is such a wealth of knowledge. We're so excited that she is given so much time to share all of the amazing resources of the Smithsonian American Art Museum and her just incredible knowledge with us today. So let's give some, I guess, round of applause on Zoom, whatever that looks like, for Peg. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you, Jared. And for those of you who were here last week, welcome you back. We asked the participants for themes that they would be interested in me digging deeper into. So that's what I've prepared for today. But this is meant to be a complement to what was done last week, and both recordings, both PowerPoints are going to be available to you after today. And I just want to iterate that everything I'm about to share with you, the questions I'm asking, the activities, I'm going to walk you through the videos that I'm going to be showing, the information behind the scenes that I'm going to share, all of that is in the notes section of the PowerPoint. So make sure you get your hands on that, and then it's all free. You are welcome to take and use this in whatever capacity is going to help you in your work. So thank you for joining us. Because my connection has been erratic a little bit here, I'm going to stop my video, but I am here, and I hope you don't mind a disembodied voice because I want you to focus anyway on the slides. I'm going to start off by doing a quick review of what I presented last week, just for those people who may not have had the opportunity to see that. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. If any of you ever have a chance to get to Washington, D.C., my museum is shared with the National Portrait Gallery, and we are 2 of the 19 Smithsonian museums. We're the largest museum complex in the world, and we are not quite on the National Mall. We're just north of it, and you are more than welcome to come, and admission is free to all of our museums, and everything I'm going to be sharing with you is also free. So that means when you go to our website, you have a chance to take advantage of any of these different resources that you see. And let me point out a few. We've got professional development that has been done on site, but also online. And anything that's been done online has been recorded. And you can go to those archived recordings and download those. We also have teacher guides and resources, and some of them are in Spanish and English. I'll get to that in a second, but I want you to know that they're organized by either subject matter or a contemporary or past topic. There's Learn from Home, which is primarily organized around things that you can do on your own with family, with friends. That includes 2 social emotional learning guides that are printable, downloadable in English and Spanish. We also have summer institutes that we offer for teachers, and we do this on the basis of you providing an essay following a form that you can find online. This gives you an opportunity to work with staff behind the scenes and come up with an arts integrated curriculum that you can take back with you and immediately use in your classrooms. And we, last but not least, have free video conference topics that we offer. And again, I'm going to get to those in just a minute. But first, I want to let you know that for the sake of time, I'm not going to play this, but this is a very short video that takes you from the courtyard inside our museum through lots of different aspects that we offer the public. And I really encourage you, if your students have not been to a museum, to play this video and ask them what they see taking place, what is going on. We get a lot of requests for people to be able to show us the insides of the museum. This is our response. It's very short. But I want to also point out that we've got videos in a lot of different capacities, including a whole series of them that have us linking with our colleagues in the other Smithsonian museums. We've gone to natural history, we've gone to air and space, even the one that you see at the far right with the beer. That's when we linked up with the new beer curator at the American History Museum. And our museum,
Okay.
yeah.
Really quickly, you're not in slide view.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. Appreciate it. Thanks. How about now?
Perfect.
Great. Thank you for that, Jared. All right. So last one on this slide, I want to point out that we are one of the few museums that have our conservation labs on view. If you can come and visit, our walls are glass, floor to ceiling, so you can look in and see how they repair frames, what they do for the media lab, which includes what do we do with film and video games that are in our collection, how are those preserved. So all this you have a chance to be able to view just from walking through our galleries. I also want to mention that these are great to be able to see the 3-minute or less videos for each of these different labs if you want to talk to your students about career awareness. And then let's go on to one great collection of lessons and video interviews and ideas for your students to get them involved in your community. We built this on a survey that was done, as you can see, from 76 to 81 in the National Endowment for the Arts. We have in our collection not all of these photographic surveys, but we do have one of Baltimore, and a colleague of mine linked up with a series of outreach centers there to work with 6th through 12th graders who went around and re-documented what they saw as changing in their neighborhood, especially when they studied the photographs taken from 76 to 81. And the reason I love sharing this with you is because you can see comprehensive lessons that have been outlined here, and it gives you a great framework by which you could take this and adapt it for your students, even younger than the middle and high school levels. So again, this is a real brief review of things that I covered. And I mentioned those free video conferences that start with 3rd grade and go through 12th. These are done for individual rooms. And I am not going to go into the 11 topics that we offer because that was covered pretty much in depth in part 1. So make sure you go back to that recording to understand what we covered. But when I say we go to individual classes, this is not an assembly. We want to get conversations going with your students, get them engaged, hear what they're thinking, have them realize that their voices are important, and we want to be able to guide them through an analysis of those artworks, as well as these different topics that reflect the strengths of our collection. For example, a teacher asked me a number of years ago what could be done to help her students learn how to be able to protest. And so we put that social commentary, social action theme together that gives you a various ways that your students can express their concerns. We also have one of the largest collections of works by and about African American artists, American Indians, as well as Latino art and culture. And we are in the midst of putting together a new topic on Asian Americans, but that's not going to be ready probably for about another year. So this slide is here just for you to be able to reference, but as I put up here in the yellow highlight, for examples, reference part 1. Now, what I do at the museum is called REACH, Rural Engagement in Art, Culture, and History. It's been my job to work in all different communities around this country. So what I'm about to share with you are topics that were suggested by the participants from last week. And I've keyed this up so that when you get this PowerPoint, all you have to do is click on any one of these themes that you want to know more about. It's going to take you right away to those slides. And I think with the time we've got today, that we'll be able to cover pretty much all of these. So I'm going to ask you to put in the chat box which themes you're particularly interested in. Helen's going to do a quick analysis of what you put in there, and we'll do it in the order that seems to be the highest priority for everybody. I'm, by the way, not able to see the chat box, so I'm going to be organizing this similar to how we would do a video conference with your students, which would be, as we go through, I'll be asking questions. Hopefully you can respond either by unmuting or putting your information in the chat box. Again, if we were doing a video conference with your students, we would hopefully have a mic set up where they could come and respond. Helen, any choices there? Anybody voting for anything?
Yes, we have a lot of activity in the chat, and it looks like color. Thank you. I just beat out
Color for the win.
one.
Yes.
But then physics would be next, and then there's several others, and I'll make sure I get a list of those compiled for you. But
Great.
colors and then physics.
Okay, so please everybody keep voting and they will keep tracking it. Okay, so as I mentioned, you can just click on color and it's going to take you directly to these slides. So I've approached each one of these topics a number of different ways. So just think about which way would be the most engaging and the most appropriate for what you teach at your grade levels. So I deliberately started off with a slide that talks about the source of colors, that when we were looking at natural materials, take a look at the azurite, green earth, and yellow ochre. And then when we've been able to develop, synthetic colors, I deliberately organized them so they're pretty much reflecting what was tried to be achieved naturally. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole coloration of this and all the sources of it, but I just want you to think about what you notice between the natural and the synthetic colors. What would an artist be able to do if they had access to those synthetic colors? Well, let's do a comparison. Which works do you think were done with the natural colors, and which do you think were done with the synthetic? Your subject might be a clue, but rather than just look at the subject, take a look at the colors that you see. Any thoughts in the chat box, Jared or Helen?
Yes, the left is the natural, and I suppose that means the right are the synthetic.
Yeah. So that was a pretty soft challenge there to do. And definitely that's what you're looking at. The work on the left was made in 1761 before the creation of any synthetic paints. And the one on the right was in the late 1800s. In fact, that enabled artists that we call impressionists to be able to paint differently than the painters before them. But let's go a little bit deeper. Let's take a look at what else they were able to achieve by focusing on their necks. Take a look at how a shadow was created with those natural colors and compared to what you see with the synthetic colors. And on the left, there's a predominance of having something that's close to gray and the browns. And on the right, you can see, well, wait a minute, there's like 8 or 9 or 10 different colors there that then when you back out, still give you the impression, when you close in, you can see that better. But when you back out, it still gives you the impression that there's a shadow there. So now what I want you to do is just turn your arm upside down. How many colors can you count on the underside of your arm? And if you were going to paint it, how many different colors would you want to use? So would you want to have access to the synthetic colors or stick with those natural ones? So as you're thinking about that, I'm going to lead you forward. And now take a look at the same subject matter of the same artwork, same composition, same artist, but different color schemes. And can you write in the chat box or unmute what impressions you get based on just the changes in the color? And when I say changes, what I'm really asking is how that change of color affects your interpretation of this subject.
It says, okay, they're going fast now. Darker is more depressing. The one on the right seems a lot more dreary. Mood changes.
Okay. So think about
Left
again
is less real.
okay. And what it might make you think about the subject, the content of what's taking place here. Does one possibly give you hope that in fixing the wheel, they can continue? Or perhaps one makes you think they're going to be here a long time and trying to get this all figured out. So what I'm trying to introduce you to is not only the impact and interpretation color, but also the choices an artist makes and how those choices influence how you interpret something. All right, now I'm about to do a treat for your eyes. I'm going to reveal the next slide, and it's got 2 different squares, each one a different color. I want you to pick one, and I want you to stare at the black asterisk that you see in the middle. This is not going to work if you move your eyes, so don't move them. Just keep staring at that black asterisk. And depending on how tired your eyes are, will depend on when you start to see what looks like an aura around that gray rectangle in the middle of that square. And that aura might look like a darker hue, a darker color of what you see around the gray rectangle. But I'm going to tell you something I want you to do. Don't do it yet until I give you the whole instructions. You are going to, when I tell you to move your eyes to the right where the white space is, and I want you to give your eyes time to let it bring up another color, because what is happening is your eyes, your rods and cones cannot see complementary colors at the same time, but they want to. So whichever block you're looking at, your eye is trying at the same time to bring up the complementary colors so that you can see a very calming gray. All right, on the count of 3, move to the right. 1, 2, 3. What do you see? It's going to be a little bit dimmer.
Someone said the complement color,
Aha.
mint green.
So if you see mint green, you're probably looking at the magenta box. So while you're writing in the chat or getting your eyes warmed up, again, what you're doing is saturating your eye with one particular color while it is trying to bring up the complement. Perhaps you've seen cards or posters or images where, especially around the holidays, there is a fire engine red next to a green, and it seems to be popping out. It's because your eye is physically moving between those two colors. It can't see them at the same time because otherwise you'd see gray. So with that in mind, I want to just bring up a color wheel. So you may have learned the primaries are fire engine red and navy blue, but guess what? I can make colors with mixing those primaries. So that navy blue, which may look a little purplish to you at this point, is actually combining cyan and magenta. And fire engine red is actually combining magenta and yellow. And I'm going to share with you, when I taught middle school art and was told my budget wouldn't let me buy magenta and cyan because it was too expensive, I had to explain to my students that they're not going to be able to get the lighter, for example, spring green, by mixing yellow and navy blue together. It just isn't possible because the more you mix colors together, the closer you get to brown, black, or gray. So for the sake of telling you about color, I've also added in what I think is one of the best color charts. And this is done by Munsell. And you'll see magenta opposite that kind of green yellow. This is also an interesting chart to use with any students that might have some form of color blindness, which usually is reflected with that complementary color. If you have trouble seeing one, you might be stronger or weaker in the complementary color. Okay, science aside, let's look at it a slightly different way. With the next image I'm going to show you, what do you see?
Snake in the leaves, leaves of a snake.
Ah, your eyes are pretty warmed up. A lot of times people only see the snake, but that's exactly what is in that pile of leaves. And this is a painting done by studies done by Abbott Henderson Thayer, who is well known for his use of looking at the environment and how animals are camouflaged in that environment. In fact, the Army used his knowledge to figure out how to develop patterns for camouflage in uniforms, on tanks, on planes. He is well known for having contributed to the general idea of patterns and camouflage. So that's a real brief taste of color that I've given you. And again, when you use this PowerPoint, once you're done with the one section, you're going to find an arrow that's going to take you back to that table of contents. So I think you said physics was the next one.
Correct.
All right. So let's go to physics. I'm going to start off with sound waves here and do a brief description of the fact that they're vibrations that travel through the air or another medium, and they can be heard when they reach your ear. Now, you may already know all this. I've just put it on this slide as a way of being able to summarize it for your students. But a sound wave is a compression and refraction by which sound is propagated in an elastic medium, such as air. This is a visual diagram just to give you an idea of how waves and compression could come from that source and be able to reach your ear. So what does that mean in terms of art? Well, think of those really basic materials. And what I'm going to do is show you a work that is displayed as it is in my museum. And what you're looking at are glass tubes. You can see they're different lengths, different widths, sometimes vary within the same tube. Some are curved. And then there's this blowtorch. And what we usually do is show a video next to this so you can understand why is there a blowtorch with these glass tubes. So bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to jump to a video. And by the way, the video that you see on the title screen here, I'll bring that back up again after I show you the video. That's the correct URL for this video. The version that I gave to Jared and Helen to share with you is not correct. So when I bring that back up, you may want to take a screenshot of it. But let me key up this video and then I'm going to start sharing with you again. And while I key this up, I want you to think, what sounds? Why am I doing a blowtorch and glass tubes with you for sound? Are you able to see a black screen right now with the term glass tube on it?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. So for the sake of time, I'm going to stop it there. And while I go back to the PowerPoint, I would love to see your ideas in the chat box of how you might teach with this. How might you use Yoon's work to talk about sound physics with your students? And remember, you may want to take a screenshot so you've got the correct URL here.
So one of the comments in the chat said, I would ask them what exactly is producing the sound. Followed up with what is the resonator and what is the actuator?
Great. Because what you're seeing, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and they added asking why does the sound pitch change? Great questions.
Mm-hmm. Because once you understand the basic definition of sound, it's just words. When you start thinking about how it again impacts you and how it affects the way you interact with your environment, and then you see somebody playing around with it like Byung-Yoon, it's really I think can easily change your idea about sound. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next one, which again, for the sake of time, I'm going to be doing a little editing throughout this presentation. But if you could imagine hearing some jazz from an artist you're familiar with, like for example, in the notes section for here, I've got a link to a John Coltrane piece. But I want you to just imagine, how would you move your hand? What kind of a drawing would you make right now if you were listening to jazz? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to show you work by SAMM Gilliam, a Washington, D.C. color artist who always listened to John Coltrane and other forms of jazz. In other words, he liked listening to somebody who broke a lot of rules. This is what he makes. The question I have for you is, what kind of rules as a painter is he breaking? So this is a different way of approaching sound than what we did before, where I'm using actual sound, hitting your ears. But here I'm having you look at sound as a way to interpret and visualize compared to the way that Jung was visualizing sound. When my museum bought this piece, Sam Gilliam's instructions were to make sure it's suspended, and you can then decide what length you want the cables to be so that you can adjust the height, whether you want to have it in the middle of a room, in a corner. It's the museum's choice. Any thoughts in the chat box about what rules he's breaking?
So we have changing the shape of the surface and putting the color into 3 dimensions.
Yeah. The name of this piece is Swing. That's also in honor of the music that he's listening to. But it also reflects the physical activity he went through to create this piece. Pouring paint onto the canvas, crunching it together, sometimes waiting for it to dry before he pulled it apart. Sam's quoted as saying, just wants to let things go. Just work and let things go. Any more thoughts in the chat?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on then to another piece, which at first may think, what does this have to do with sound? But if you look closely, and I'm going to zoom in here for you, you're going to see in the window behind a scrim that there's a camcorder, and the artist has us pointing it out to the sky. And then you'll notice in the monitor to the left here that there look to be some black spots. And I have a close-up of that in a minute. But I want you to notice there's a couple of monitors, and then there are black speakers arranged on the wall. This work is called Cloud Music. So I want you to go look at one of the drawings he has. We don't always get the thinking that an artist has gone through to create their piece, but you can look this up in our collection and find a lot more of his plans that explain his process and the technical aspects of hooking this all up. But he's arranged it so that as clouds move across each of these plus points, they create a sound. And that is the composing, that is the music, that is the piece. So I'm going to get out again of the PowerPoint. And I want you to think, what might that sound like? What kind of sounds would clouds make in regards to how he's rigged this up? So do you now see a YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure. All right, listen for a minute. So again, you can find that on our website along with the artwork. Any about how you might use all these different approaches to sound?
We have a so cool and very space age, not at all what I was expecting.
So you're probably getting the idea
Oh.
by now. There, go ahead.
Hold on, sorry. It says, I hear the electronic waves would be interesting to view, see it under different conditions, very cloudy, windy, etc. And then the next one is
Mm,
might be a good way to challenge students preconceptions.
mhm, definitely. And then also think about what kind of a setup they would need to do if they wanted to apply this to something else. I mean, this is definitely, predicated by what nature chooses to do. But what if they did something else, something that might, be human behavior or so? A lot of possibilities there to consider. All right. So now we've done sound waves and music, and oh, I can go to motion and balance. Is that okay if we had physics as a choice?
Yes, there was a vote for motion and balance. So I
All
think
right.
that would be very appreciated.
And you're
So
not
I'm going to
inclined
start
to
off.
again.
Oh, I am. Okay. Thank you, Jared. Appreciate it. The trickiness of jumping between these different settings. Okay, here we go. So what I did was start off with that basic description of a fulcrum to be able to then understand levers. And in the notes with this section, if you already had a chance to peek at them, I'm asking questions like, what is a fulcrum and how does a seesaw act like that? And asking students to even think about putting their finger up to the sky and pointing it to try to balance a pencil on the tip of their finger if that was a fulcrum. All right, so once they've had a chance to practice that, then I want them to think about the arms on either side of a fulcrum and why, for example, in this, they're shown as being equal. So keep that in mind, but then take a look at this sculpture, actually a small model done by Alexander Calder called Antlers. Can you see where the fulcrum is? Let me zoom in for you.
Yeah.
Remember, that's the point at which it would balance. I think you can probably see it. That very tiny wire separating those two pieces. But the arms are obviously not the same length. So how can it balance? If you applied a really gentle force to one side of this, it would start to swing back and forth. So anybody, any thoughts? How did Calder make these two arms balance? And while you're writing there, I'm
Oh,
going to give you that close up again, the fulcrum.
okay. By using more dimensions in the space, the different positioning of the arms. Well,
Mhm.
if it was this, so Pat says, well, if it was me trying, it would be a trial and error. I suspect mathematics is involved.
Oh, definitely. And also weight.
And Carrie Chris says, not just an XY axis.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to show this to you because Alexander Calder, if you're familiar with the fact that he's the one credited with inventing mobiles, this is a very, very simple design, but very complex in trying to figure out how to be able to make it balance. Even that arc of the top piece that goes down to the fulcrum. So what if you had a more complex piece? How does this balance? You've got a fulcrum, as you can see with the blow up here on the right, that's very high off the base, but yet lots and lots of arms coming off of it, if I could call them arms and branches. Well, for the sake of time, I'm not going to show it, but I have a URL link in the notes section for you able to look at the footage of Nick Walenda, a type rope artist that you may have heard about, who has gone across city skyscrapers and volcanoes. And what you see in that video is him holding a very long pole. What do you think that pole might have to do in terms of his balance? And what that pole might have to do with this sculpture? Any thoughts? And by the way, the pole that Nick Wallen is using in the video weighs 43 pounds.
The pole helps adjust the fulcrum.
Yeah. The whole point of that pole is to make his body be the fulcrum with that tightrope. So he's got to be able to balance himself with that pole. If he didn't have it, if he didn't have that length to counterbalance his own weight and the tightrope that he's walking on, it wouldn't work. Same with the sculpture. All these different parts offset the weight of these pieces that are above the fulcrum of it. So with that in mind, how do you think these two open frames would move? They're designed to be able to be outside. And I'm going to have you look at it for another few seconds, and then I'm going to key up the video that shows how this moves. Take a look at where you see the pivot, the attachments, which you might call the fulcrums. Notice one is on that side of the bar, the frame, this is on this side. And sometimes when I've used this in a video conference, I've asked students to, again, think about a pencil or put a frame finger and how would they balance it? Let me get out of this. I'm going to stop sharing. Think about how those two would move. And based on what we just talked about in terms of a pole, and based on where you saw the pivot points, all set? You can see them?
Yes.
Okay. Did you guess that they would move like this? And the movement is generated by how the air is blowing. There's no motor attached to this. So why don't you think that they're moving just in plain circles, pivoting around like a pinwheel? Any thoughts?
The first comment is it was hard to imagine how they might move without hitting each other. I would add that it still is.
So even though you could see where the fulcrums were, where the point was for them to be able to be joined, excuse me, what you can't see is the fact that he's got weights inside those frames at different points that determine how they're going to swing and move with the air. So once I've used this with students, and once we go through the idea of a fulcrum and weights and balance, being able to think about how you could make what seem to be two frames almost the exact same size and be attached what looks like at first the same pivot points move completely differently, and as Jared said, not knock into each other. All right, how are we doing? What's the next request?
So the next request is Harlem Renaissance.
Okay.
And then we have a tie between a couple of options. So I'm going to share them so that if there are strong opinions about what else people would like, they can start putting that into the chat so I can track that. So that's Persuasion, Impact, World War I, and World War II. So
All right. Let's see
Harlem
if
Renaissance.
we can kind of, I think we can pretty much cover all of those. So last week, I forgot to mention that it's going to be pretty obvious when I go through a number of these works that they can be used in different topics, not just for Harlem Renaissance, for example, but works by and about African American artists, things that depict even the basics of human necessity, shelter, how we're able to survive, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to mention that, and that can apply for just about all the works that I'm going to show you. And I mentioned this last week in regards to just the idea of African American artists and then African Americans and what may have compelled them to want to leave the South and move to the North, which is the progression in the beginning of Harlem Renaissance. Is there anything in this image that would make you think people might want to move?
First response, yes.
Okay. So that might be my opening question, but the section that we're about to go through goes to these questions. What was the Harlem Renaissance like? What's the value of studying it today? What inspired and continues to inspire African American artists? What are they communicating? And which subjects resonate with artists today from the past to the present? Now, that's a lot, and I'm going to be pulling together using very few artworks because, again, what I'm doing to give you a taste today. So here's that artwork again. And if you've had a chance to study it with your students and think about what in here would make you want to change your lifestyle, then compare it to this woman's lifestyle. How are they similar? How are they different, if at all? What do you see?
So there were some more comments about the first image, right? So the squalor, the high horizon line, and the downward slope of the small figure. And we'll see what comes in as far as the comparisons.
Yeah, and along with the downward slope of the figure, look at what else echoes that. The horizon line. You're mentioning also, the roof line of this one particular building. And keep that slope in mind when you take a look at the photograph. While you're writing in the chat box, I'll tell you a little bit about the woman. It's Miss Williams, Frances Williams. And she had this taken on the day that she became the head of the Manhattan Temple Bible Club. Any thoughts in the chat box?
So the composition and general shapes are very similar.
It's
Right.
good news. The composition, even though the content within that composition is completely different between these works.
Right. One looks like hard back-breaking work, and the other is, of course, the room's full of flowers and beautiful things. Okay. Figure is looking up and out of the frame, whereas the previous figure looks down and entrapped in the frame. The
Mm-hmm.
next comment, the position of the woman at the top instead of at the bottom of slope makes a very different impression of the woman standing.
Oh, great. And I'm sure you mean that word standing in a number of different ways, because she obviously has a very different societal standing than the woman who's in the painting. So this was a photograph taken by James Van der Zee. He's an African American photographer, and he worked primarily in New York's Harlem neighborhood. And imagine, first of all, what it would take to afford him, and what you would want to show if you're inviting somebody into your home as opposed to going to a studio. So there's a lot of pride here. People are very proud of being in show what they've accomplished, and what ways can they do that? By having their photograph taken and possibly a number of prints that they can share. So we like to contrast these two to think about what people might have heard of that are in the South, what they might dream of, what might compel them to go to what they think is going to be a better life. And
Another
I know,
another
go
comment.
ahead.
It's interesting that the human figure is in the foreground in one and the back in the other.
And back in the other. Yeah. And foreground and background, we use those terms, especially in the art field, to imply a number of different things. It may not necessarily not be a good or a bad thing, but just keeping those terms in mind and thinking about that again in terms of the composition. Now, included in here works that I know we covered last week. So I'm just going to briefly go over how this is Bessie Smith, and you can play a link that has her singing Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out, and listen to that to think about the blues and the importance of the blues. I also divided this in half so that you can compare a poem by Langston Hughes and the words that he uses to what you see in the image. This is done by Romare Bearden, an African American artist who's known for using collage. And now, what I want you to do is think of an image. Let's reverse it. Let's flip what originally I showed you as an image. Now I'm going to show you another poem done by Conti Cullen. And what image does this conjure up in your mind? Take a minute to read it. Anybody? What might you visualize reading a poem like that? Any thoughts in the chat?
None yet. Maybe a
All
tough
right.
laboring scene or
No, my thought was not so much image related, but I was drawn to the fact that the analogy of the limbs like apple boughs, and then the reference to sin and some of those iconic connections stood out to me.
To
I
do
was
it.
curious.
Yeah.
I was curious if that was significant.
Yeah. So the poem that I've
okay,
put
we
here.
have one, a church
Okay.
service or a juke joint. And
Love
then
it.
the next one was I just feel exhaustion and mercy and maybe being alone outdoors.
Ah, wonderful. So great. Okay, let me show you the artwork I've paired it up with, although this poem was not written and was not inspired by this artwork. But it definitely by what we might call the jitterbug. And in the notes, I've put in a link where you can play, if the students aren't familiar with it, an example of a jitterbug dancing. And think about what connections you see between the poems and the visualization. And then think about all those examples that people have just suggested in the chat box. You might want to do that same process with your students that I've just done with you before giving them something concrete like this artwork. Ask them what those words conjure up in their mind. As I mentioned last week, part of what I'm doing with you is also not only showing you art as a way of teaching all these other subjects, but also strategies of how to be able to get somebody to look at an artwork and get something out of it. So this work was done during the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the next work that I'm about to show you. But before I reveal it, I want you to think, if you're going to do a portrait of yourself that was going to teach the viewer about you, what would you include? And you can make analogies between this and a selfie. And you don't need to write that in the chat box. I just want you to have that in mind for when you look at this next artwork. How would you analyze this person's character based on his expression, body language, and what objects, you see there? And by the way, what's brown and framed to the left of him is an easel. This is a self-portrait. It's by an artist named Malvin Gray Johnson. What's he trying to say about himself?
All right, the first was artist or poet, so we know that. He looks introspective.
Hmm.
Nonconformist.
What do you see that makes you say that?
Carrie Chris said nonconformist. I said introspective.
Okay.
Carrie, you want to elaborate? From his clothes.
Ah.
Next person, the way he's positioned, the way he's positioned lower to the viewer is interesting, waiting for our approval.
Uh-huh.
And Dana said, Guy is into theater and art, but it gives a lot of Cafe Van Gogh vibes.
Uh-huh. And I can imagine pretty much what you're looking at that gives you the idea of theater and Van Gogh and the cafe idea. All right, great. And also think about where he positions you as the viewer looking at him. Plus, no matter what, his eyes are locked on yours.
Yeah.
All right, compare that and what you just, the analysis strategies that you just used. And I'm going to show you a second artwork by a different artist. This is not a self-portrait. I want you to try to think of how many different masks you see in this. And how might you describe each of them? While you're thinking, this was painted by Lois Malo Jones. She's a Black woman. And she saw many white artists painting artworks that included African imagery. So she wanted to celebrate her own heritage and show the power and beauty of these masks.
So we have a response primal and intimidating. Someone sees 5 masks. Confrontational, strong, emotional presence.
Great. Yeah, there are 5 masks in here. And there's also a fetish sculpture. So she's
Right.
studied masks from very diverse non-Western civilizations. And she found that these are really powerful, being able to include in her work an ancestry spirit and maybe the heterogeneous, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with that word, heterogeneous nature of African culture, realizing that they are diverse people across a vast continent. So I wanted to give you a chance to be able to look at completely different ways people have done portraits. And here is a work by an African American artist, Kara Walker. And I showed this last week, but in a completely different way. I literally layered it similar to the way that Kara Walker layered it. So I'm using it a little bit different way here for you to think about a very, very powerful, complex work and how it can be used. But a brief background for those who were not with us last week. Kara Walker is an African American artist working today who has taken Harper's Weekly prints, which was the most popular red newspaper during the Civil War. And silhouettes were the way that people remembered themselves to their loved ones. And she has placed the cutout silhouette and cut out another silhouette on top of this Harper's Weekly print. And you can spend a lot of time looking at the purpose for the original print and then how her silhouettes, if you think of them as a frame, if you think of them as black and white, if you think of them as positive and negative space, there's a lot of different ways to think about how she changed the original meaning of this work. And then I want to end with one last piece, which is by Lava Thomas, and it was done in honor of the 9 men and women who died in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, from gunfire. And there's a URL in the notes section of this slideshow of her giving a very powerful talk in front of this work about all the symbolism that she used and why she used tambourines, black skin, burned the names into that black skin, and how she arranged it, and also left some of the tambourines with plastic covers on them so that when people would walk up to look closely at the work, they would see themselves reflected in it and hopefully find some purpose from it. Any thoughts about any of the works I've just shown you and how you might use them? I deliberately tried to take you from works that were pretty simple to ones that are more complex.
While people pose their questions, Peg, what time period was Kara Walker doing that work with the Harper's Bazaar?
With the Harper's Weekly, as you know,
Or
was
weekly?
done during the Civil War.
Yeah, but I mean, Kara doing that work, I've not seen those.
Yeah, to do that. Let me double check the exact date of that. She has recently, by the way, been highlighted in different biennials around the world. This work is from 2005.
Okay.
And it's not the only one that she's done, it's a whole series.
Right. All right. Any thoughts from participants about how they would use? I mean, obviously the juxtaposition, the social history, the implications. I mean, this is just me rattling on now, but this piece is fascinating. I love it.
I think we have a lot of people deep in thought right now.
I know we
processing their
do.
answers.
Yeah. And I've never seen this piece. This is amazing. I have to come to the museum.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I mentioned last week, and I want to reiterate that there's obviously a lot of information packed into each of these, and I'm only covering a little bit of the notes that I have in each of them. And I suggested that a way of being able to use these with your students is to print out each work with the notes and give each one to a different student and have that student take the responsibility on of asking the questions or giving the background information and leading the discussion. Helen, remind me what were the next ones where there was, I think, a
So
tie between the next.
Well, persuasion ended up getting a couple of extra votes. And then the other
Okay.
topic would be World War I and World War II. So those are the last two that I have. But
All
if there's
right.
other things people would like, please drop that in the chat so I can catch that.
All right. I think we can probably cover both of those pretty well and still have room for the last learning lab. So take a look at this. And questions I would ask if I was using it with your students is, what's going on? Where does the artist place you as a viewer? Do you feel manipulated by it?
You have a
Is it
geometry
biased?
comment
I'm sorry, was there a comment, Jared?
of geometry.
Okay.
It's been noted. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you think it presents a particular point of view, and is that point of view politically infused? So while you're looking at that and thinking of those questions, I'll tell you that in April 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a series of demonstrations, they wanted to challenge segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. But the Public Safety Commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, instructed the police to squelch the protests. This was covered by a photograph that appeared in Life magazine. I'm going to show you the photograph, and I want you to compare it to the print that you see on the left-hand side, which was done by Andy Warhol, a name you might recognize. And I want you to look at how it's been altered, how Andy Warhol has changed it. And I want you to think which one to you is more powerful, which one might persuade you to act, which one could possibly be propaganda. And if I was doing this with your students, I would have, talked about the definition of persuasion and propaganda.
So
and
we
have them and apply it. Go ahead. Yeah,
we
Jared.
have a comment. The print is really high contrast. It's more difficult to see what's going on, almost disorienting.
Yeah, so with that in mind, you might not be able to make a decision as to whether it might persuade you to act or whether it's a form of propaganda. And not only did he, use that more contrasty work, but he also eliminated the gray colors. What does that say when you're working with a group of white people versus Black people? Then you also may have noticed by now that he flipped it. He also cropped it. So
Yeah,
again,
if I
go
were
ahead.
responding, it feels like you're in the print.
Ah,
Warhol, it's almost Warhol's. It's almost more like a documenting it, like for again for a newspaper or something. You're reporting on an action versus being engaged in it.
yeah. So again, that position of where you're placed as a viewer.
All right, there's one more. Metaphorically, there is no gray area on the subject. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So then, with those opening questions and ideas, look at this painting done by Norman Lewis, also an African-American artist. I want you to think about what you see. I'm going to zoom in on it. Excuse me. Let me zoom in on it. And how does your brain make sense of this? Anybody want to write in the chat box? What are you seeing?
Civil War.
Ooh. And if you put down something like that, can you explain why you think that? What is it you're seeing that gives you that idea?
Before that, follow up American flag colors, people
Ah,
holding up flags, smoke obscuring colors and meaning.
ah,
It's like soldiers, and you have red versus blue. And that was the follow up to Civil War.
yeah.
It's
Okay,
like
great.
soldiers, yeah.
Thank you. So
And
yeah,
then
go ahead.
Jen Whitaker says geographical, American related for sure, maybe a larger landscape.
Aha. So you're looking at a work that was done in 1962. It's at a time when New York art critics in the 50s and 60s said painting could be about nothing except painting. That anyone who argued otherwise risked bad press and could lose sales. But this artist, Norman Lewis, named this evening rendezvous. So think about your first interpretations and how that plays with that title. And he's definitely trying to mock patriotism by the use of colors that you normally see in the flag. And the white, as you identified as figures, are meant to be Klansmen. And they're brighter towards the bottom of the canvas because of how they would illuminate their events with headlights from their cars.
There's one more comment that said almost looks like an upside down peace sign.
Oh, and when you think about that, how it's been flipped or upside down. So here he's trying to bring that turmoil of the civil rights movement into the gallery. He's trying to get close to figural painting, but also was doing abstract because he knew that's what the movement, that's what the flavor was at the time. That's what people were spending money on. So now that you know the subject matter here, I'll leave you with the question, is it persuasive or propaganda? Now, because of time, I'm going to move on to another piece. And I'm going to tell you that this is called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Excuse me, it's By Any Means Necessary, in parens, after Malcolm X. When I tell you that, does it make you look at those broad strokes differently? To actually see an M and an X? And let me tell you a little bit about this work. It was done by an artist named Tim Rollins, who has passed, and he gathered a group of students, high school students together that he was working with in South Bronx. And he called them the Kids of Survival, or KOS. And he was working with them by reading the literary classics and exploring their meaning and connections to contemporary life. They decided to create this piece and put on the back of it pages from Malcolm X's autobiography. They mean those black lines crossing over the text to function both as a monogram for his name and also as censors to the text. because you may be aware that his autobiography was banned from many high schools during the height of the Civil War movement. So within this piece, they're actually demonstrating that banning. And knowing what you know today about books and banning and what's going on, think about whether this would be persuasive or propaganda. Then I'm going to move to one more work.
So, Peg, there's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So the question is, are the definitions of persuasion versus propaganda explained specifically in your online materials?
No, I did not include that in here. And I apologize, but I think you can find it would be good for you based on the grade level that you're working with to go and find those definitions that you think would make the most sense to your students. But I will give you a hint. Usually by the time I finish doing this presentation, they realize that the definitions between those are easily blurred and that one work may even be both. And that's honestly part of my goal.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let me show you one more work. This was done by the artist Alfredo Jar. He's Chilean born, but he moved to New York in 1982. And when he came there, he was really troubled to find out that racial tensions still ran high, especially after the civil rights movement had pretty much passed its zenith. So in Life magazine in April 1968, he saw a photograph that you see on the left here, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral. And he started looking at the number of black and white mourners. It's been a long day, sorry, mourners. So in the second and the third panel of this triptych, which color do you think represents the black mourners versus the white mourners? I pretty much gave you a big hint there.
Yeah. Clearly the black. Yeah, black is black, red is white.
Yeah.
That's in the comment.
So let me ask you, what significance could it be that he presents this as a triptych? Think about what that format, where that's been used. Where do you usually find triptychs?
Religious connotation.
Yep.
From Dana. Altars from Sarah
Yep.
Well.
Yep. So what he's really saying to you, or to the interpreter, that he's identifying King as a martyr.
So someone said typically associated with saints.
Yep, exactly. Saints or martyrdom. So we're looking not only at how he's taken that content and he's processed it through a certain form of analysis and data, but then how he's organized it all together in a format that we subconsciously or consciously associate with a whole nother level of interpreting, King. All right, so I hope I'm leaving you with more questions than answers on that one. But let me jump to World War I and World War II. And by now, I'm approaching these subjects from very different ways. This is not going to be a chronology of battles. This is not going to tell you exactly why we got into it and how we got out of it. Instead, I'm looking at the context of both these wars. And I'm starting with a poster that was done by a British publication, done by an artist who didn't even need to have his name on here because he was well known. And his name, Kitchener, was known for having created what was called a differential rotation effect. The idea being that when you take a look at the eyes, they seem to follow you no matter where you go. And guess how that influenced one of our more famous icons, And you might want to just move your head from left to right and see if Uncle Sam's eyes follow you. It's called differential rotational effect. So when you take a look at this and realize what government was doing to try to get you to support the war, possibly even sign up to fight, you've got a poster, you've got an image that literally makes you feel like it's going to follow you home. So I apologize for not including the propaganda definition in the last section, but I did put it in this section. So you can certainly reference this and put it in the other section if you wish. Now, with that in mind, which poster would be more persuasive to you for either its propaganda reason or the way it's composed to make you either join up and fight or support buying Liberty bonds? How about a vote, left or right? Which one would make you act either in terms of volunteering your body or your money? Any votes coming in?
At the moment, we're 3 for the right and 1 for Uncle Sam.
Ah,
And
okay.
Uncle Sam said the justification was more intimidating and singles the viewer out. Oh,
Ah, right. So you've got two very, very different effects here. When you look at the content of the one on the right, you might recognize the Statue of Liberty here, having lost her head. Did this actually really happen?
no.
Could it possibly happen?
And so there's the comment, right, is more dynamic and plays on the fear of what if.
Aha. Yep. And thank goodness it never really happened, but there's that possibility. And exactly that's what's being played on. So let me now go to another work. And this is Woodrow Wilson. Based on this work, would you be compelled to follow this man into war? Even regardless of his words? So when you think about World War I, it was considered to be the war to end all wars. Didn't even have the idea of being number one because at the time nobody could have imagined there'd be a second one. In the notes section, I do have more information here about General George Pershing and his experience and what he was doing to help reinforce his ability to be able to fight. But I'm really going to focus more on which would compel you more, Woodrow Wilson on the right or General George Pershing, the bust that you see on the left. Just keep that in mind.
So there is a comment. It says, based on the style, no, but it seems that he's being placed on battle plans, which would indicate competence.
Ah, all right. So it may not come from the body language, but it may come from the context that he surrounds himself in.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on to the next works. This was done by an artist who was enlisted in the Army in 1917, Kerr Eby, and he began as a member of an ambulance crew. He wasn't paid as an artist, but he sketched what he experienced and turned those into prints. So think about where your eye goes first. Think about the message he's giving you about what life was like. Do you feel like you're actually there? Does it show you the horrors of war as much as we know about it now because of what we see with war today? So the one on the left is called in the open, and the one on the right is Lodgings for the Night. Do those titles change the way you're interpreting these works? And what if color was added to them? Would that make a difference in how you interpret them? So think of that compared to this work.
So we have a comment that says,
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Barren landscapes, possibly dead soldiers is the first interpretation. And then I have on the left, I see struggle. On the right, I see squalor and discomfort.
Yeah, so you're beginning to get a sense of what it must have been like to actually be out there fighting. And then compare that to this work. And if you're an historian, you might be able to recognize which army this is from their helmets. But this was done by Claggett Wilson, who was embedded as an artist in the works. And he calls it the dance of death. And when you think about dance, you don't normally associate it with the word of death or the idea and the conflict of death. But look at how he's composed this. Look at how the patterns, which you recognized earlier with the work by Williams and the photograph by James Van Der Zee and the woman working in the South. Think of how he's used repetition, how he's used the bodies to break those patterns, and giving it the title of the Dance of Death. And for the sake of time, I'm going to jump to another work. And I had deliberately blocked out part of the back because I want you to take a look at first at these three figures. Notice that they all have halos. But what do their bodies' positions tell you? What does the fact that there's a skeleton in the back tell you? This was an editorial cartoon that was created more than 15 years after the war ended. This is what he included in the background. So you could have a whole discussion here about who was involved, what layers were playing out during the whole course of the war.
So we have his comments. Wow, that's powerful on many levels. I can't handle it too deep. And given what we know now, the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, great. Now we're getting close to the end time, and I want to make sure that's World War One. So what I kicked off with the section for World War II was this worksheet that we provided with students that could be applicable to any war, but it just happened to have World War II on it. And those questions would be questions we would give students at the beginning of a video conference and ask them to think about how to respond to those based on the artworks they're about to see. So I wanted to mention this one, which was done by Shimamura. He's a Japanese American artist who was interned when he was a young boy in the camps that were set aside for Japanese Americans during World War II. And this is done on a diary notation his grandmother made a few days before they were placed in the camps. And she says, I spent all day at home. Starting from today, we were permitted to withdraw $100 from the bank. This was for our sustenance of life. We who are enemy to them, I deeply feel America's large-heartedness in dealing with us. Look at all those conflicting emotions in her quote. And then I have in the notes section a number of things to think about with the figure that you see the shadow of on the paper wall. So again, for the sake of time, let me jump ahead. You've got William H. Johnson, an African-American artist who's looking at segregation and how he suggests that African-American soldiers were kept separate from the whites. And then this is an artwork that was done by John Stewart Curry. He did it when the stock market had crashed and plunged the US into the Great Depression. He was contacted by the government to ask if they could use this to create a poster. I want you to take a look at how the government transformed it. And I know I showed you posters before, but I wanted you to realize that the government knew that you had to play on people's emotions, like was mentioned earlier, about the ability to be able to compel people to pay for things. And the last work I'm going to show you is a work that you can walk through and analyze how this tells you about what was going on in the home front during World War II. Then you're going to see different parts picked up and highlighted on this work that talk about the sacrifices that Americans made during World War II. Now, I've cut it really close to the end. Can I quick introduce Learning Lab, Helen and Jared?
Yes, please.
All right. So if you're when you're at your computer, I'd like you to type in this URL, and you're going to see this homepage. And I'm introducing this to you because you now have access through this to every digitized resource throughout the whole Smithsonian Institution. And if you go up to the search tool, type in any term that you want, and what will come up will be resources that you can literally cut and paste into what we call a collection. You register for free. You can start a collection as many as you wish. It's all free. And whatever term you put in there, whatever comes up, it could be an artifact, a paper, an article, a video interview. You can take any of those and pull it into your own collection and share that URL with your students, because you've already put together primary resources that you want them to have access to. You've already vetted them. You can even have your students do this, depending on their ages, and have them use it as a portfolio or as a way of being able to do research and share that research with you as an assignment. You're going to notice that there's a link once you put that term in there that says resources, and there's one that says collections. So if you click on collections, you're going to find what other people have pulled together on that particular theme, that particular term. You can also adapt those collections for your own purposes. So I've hit you with a lot of information. And I'm sorry I went over a few minutes there to be able to get everything in.
All right. Helen has just put, well, first off, Peg, thank you.
Oh,
This was
you're welcome.
so great. I personally have an art history degree, and I've learned so much and can't wait to learn more. But for all in attendance, Helen just put the link to go through and give us your feedback, get your professional development certificate, and all of those good things. And everyone's saying thanks, Peg. And
Oh,
we
that's
will
great.
get
Thanks.
this edited and uploaded. Yes, Helen, amazing content and resources. So I thank you. Helen, do you have anything you'd like to say to close?
I just want to thank you again. This is such a wealth of resources. And I also want to thank everyone that took time out of their Thursday evening to spend time and learn about this, or if you're watching this later, for taking an hour and a half to review this, or 3 hours if you did both. This is just absolutely incredible. And we are so grateful, Peg, for you to be here and share all of this with us. So thank you.
You're more than welcome. I love doing this. I love spreading the word about our resources.